This photograph you are seeing now might appear to be merely another Victorian family portrait from 1886. A well-dressed family posed formally in their drawing room, the father standing proudly behind his seated wife, their two daughters positioned elegantly beside them. But if you look more closely, if you truly observe the details that most people prefer to ignore, you will begin to perceive something profoundly disturbing about the fifth figure in this image. The boy standing at the far left of the composition, his pale hand resting on the mother's chair, his dark eyes staring directly at the camera with an intensity that seems to pierce through time itself. This child should not exist. According to every official record, every birth certificate, every family document discovered in the archives, the Whitmore family of Manchester, England, had only 2 children. Yet here he stands, captured forever in silver nitrate and gelatin, as real and present as any member of the family. This is not a case of photographic error or double exposure. This is one of the most enigmatic and disturbing mysteries in the history of Victorian photography. And the story behind it goes far beyond what any historical documentation would dare to acknowledge. In the autumn of 1886, Manchester stood as one of England's most prosperous industrial centres. The cotton mills that had built the city's fortune continued to churn out textiles for the British Empire, while the newly wealthy merchant class established themselves in elegant townhouses throughout the fashionable districts. It was an era of unprecedented prosperity, but also of rigid social conventions where family reputation meant everything, and any deviation from accepted norms could destroy a household's standing in society. The Whitmore family epitomized this new industrial aristocracy. Henry Whitmore had built his fortune through textile manufacturing, establishing one of Manchester's most successful cotton processing facilities. His wife, Margaret, came from old Yorkshire money, bringing both social connections and substantial dowry to their marriage. Their daughters, Catherine, 16, and Elizabeth, 14, were being groomed for advantageous marriages that would further cement the family's social position. By all accounts, the Whitmores were a model Victorian family. They attended St. Andrew's Episcopal Church regularly, maintained an elegant household with appropriate domestic staff, and participated actively in Manchester's social and charitable activities. Henry served on the boards of several cultural institutions, while Margaret organized charity events for the city's less fortunate residents. Their daughters received the finest education available to young ladies of their station, studying music, languages, and the domestic arts that would prepare them for their future roles as wives and mothers. The decision to commission a formal family portrait was made in September 1886 as part of the preparations for Catherine's upcoming presentation to society. Such portraits were essential markers of social status, designed to be displayed prominently in the family home and to serve as permanent records of the household's prosperity and respectability. The photographer chosen for this important commission was Mr. Augustus Pembroke, one of Manchester's most distinguished portrait artists. Pembroke had established his reputation through his work with the city's elite families, creating formal portraits that captured not just physical likenesses, but the essential character and social standing of his subjects. His studio on King Street was considered the finest photographic establishment north of London. The photographic session was scheduled for October 15, 1886, a crisp autumn afternoon that provided the perfect natural lighting conditions that Pembroke preferred for his formal portraits. The Whitmore family arrived at the studio precisely at 2 o'clock, dressed in their finest clothing and prepared for what they expected would be a straightforward, if lengthy, photographic session. Pembroke had arranged his studio with meticulous care. The backdrop was an elegant burgundy velvet drapery that would provide appropriate contrast for the family's formal attire. Ornate furniture had been positioned to create a composition that suggested both comfort and dignity. Every detail had been planned to produce a portrait worthy of the Whitmore family's social aspirations. The session began normally, with Pembroke carefully positioning each family member to create the most flattering and dignified arrangement. Henry stood behind Margaret's chair, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Catherine and Elizabeth were positioned on either side of their seated mother, their postures carefully adjusted to convey both youthful grace and proper deportment. Pembroke worked with the methodical precision for which he was known, making minute adjustments to posture, expression, and the fall of fabric. The process was lengthy, as Victorian photography required extended exposure times that demanded absolute stillness from the subjects. Multiple test compositions were arranged and evaluated before the final positioning was achieved. It was during these preparations that something extraordinary occurred, something that Pembroke would spend the rest of his life trying to understand and explain. As he was making his final adjustments to the camera position, Pembroke became aware of a subtle change in the studio's atmosphere. The quality of light seemed to shift almost imperceptibly, and there was a strange sense of additional presence in the room, as if someone else had quietly entered without being noticed. When Pembroke looked up from his camera, he was startled to see that the family composition had changed. Where moments before there had been 4 people arranged in careful formation, there were now 5. A boy of perhaps 12 years old had appeared at the far left of the group, his pale hand resting naturally on Margaret Whitmore's chair as if he had always been part of the family arrangement. The boy was dressed in formal attire, consistent with the family's elegant clothing, a dark jacket and crisp white collar that matched the style worn by the other family members. His dark hair was neatly combed in the fashion typical of well-born children of the era, but there was something in his eyes, an intensity and awareness that seemed far beyond his apparent age, that made Pembroke deeply uncomfortable. Most disturbing of all was the family's reaction to the boy's presence. They showed no surprise, no acknowledgement that anything had changed. Margaret Whitmore continued to sit with perfect composure, even though a strange child's hand now rested on her chair. Henry maintained his dignified pose behind his wife, apparently unconcerned by the additional figure in their family portrait. The daughters remained in their carefully arranged positions, their expressions serene and appropriate. Pembroke, his professional composure shaken, attempted to address the situation diplomatically. "Excuse me, Mr. Whitmore," he said carefully, "but I wasn't aware that you had a son. Should I adjust the lighting to better accommodate the additional subject?" Henry Whitmore's response was both puzzling and unsettling. He looked directly at Pembroke with mild confusion, as if the photographer had asked an incomprehensible question. "I'm sorry, Mr. Pembroke, but I don't understand what you mean. We are ready to proceed whenever you are prepared." Pembroke glanced again at the boy, who was now looking directly at him with those penetrating dark eyes. There was something in that gaze that made the photographer's hands tremble as he attempted to adjust his equipment. "The young man," Pembroke persisted, gesturing toward the left side of the composition. "I notice he's positioned himself quite naturally with the family, but I want to ensure the lighting is optimal for all 5 subjects." The Whitmore family exchanged glances that seemed to communicate some private understanding, but their expressions remained politely bewildered. "Mr. Pembroke," Margaret said gently, "there are only the 4 of us present. Perhaps the strain of positioning the lights has affected your vision. We are quite ready to proceed with the photograph whenever you feel the composition is satisfactory." Pembroke found himself in the extraordinary position of questioning his own perception. The boy was clearly visible to him, standing no more than 10 feet away, as solid and real as any other person in the room. Yet the family's sincere confusion suggested that they perceived something entirely different. Professional instinct overcame personal bewilderment. Pembroke had built his reputation on creating portraits that satisfied his clients, regardless of any personal considerations. If the family was content with their arrangement, he would proceed with the session and address his own perceptual concerns later. The exposure time required for the formal portrait was approximately 4 minutes, during which all subjects needed to remain absolutely motionless. Pembroke removed the lens cap and began the lengthy process of capturing the image, all the while acutely aware of the 5th figure, whose presence the family seemed unable to acknowledge. During those 4 minutes, Pembroke observed the mysterious boy with growing unease. Unlike the other family members, who maintained the slightly rigid postures necessary for successful photography, the boy seemed unnaturally still, as if complete motionlessness was his natural state rather than a difficult requirement. His eyes never blinked, never shifted focus, but remained fixed on the camera lens with an intensity that made Pembroke increasingly nervous. More disturbing still was the gradual change in the studio's atmosphere during the exposure. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees despite the October afternoon's warmth. The quality of light became strangely flat and diffused, as if something were absorbing the natural illumination that had been so carefully arranged. Even the sounds from the busy street outside seemed muffled and distant. When the exposure was finally complete, Pembroke replaced the lens cap with hands that trembled more than professional composure should have allowed. The mysterious boy remained in his position for several seconds after the other family members had begun to relax and move. his unblinking gaze still fixed on the camera. Only when Pembroke began packing his equipment did the child finally turn away, moving with a fluid grace that seemed somehow unnatural. As the Whitmore family prepared to leave, they made arrangements for the developed portrait to be delivered to their home within the week. Their manner throughout these final interactions was perfectly normal and pleasant, with no acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred during the session. Only as the family reached the studio door did Margaret Whitmore pause and turn back to Pembroke with an expression that might have been concern. "Mr. Pembroke," she said quietly, "I hope you won't find our family portrait disturbing in any way. Sometimes photographs capture more than we intend them to, don't they?" Before Pembroke could respond, the family had departed, leaving him alone in the studio with the exposed photographic plate and a growing sense that he had documented something far more significant than a simple family portrait. The process of developing the photograph would normally have been routine for an experienced photographer like Pembroke. He had created hundreds of formal portraits using identical techniques and equipment. But as he worked in the red-lit darkness of his developing room, he found himself approaching the task with unusual anxiety. The image emerged from the chemical solutions exactly as he had expected, yet somehow completely different from what he had thought he was capturing. The Whitmore family appeared in perfect formal arrangement, Henry standing behind Margaret's chair, the daughters positioned elegantly on either side. Every detail of their clothing, their expressions, their careful postures had been captured with the technical excellence for which Pembroke was known. But there, at the far left of the composition, stood the mysterious boy, not as a vague shadow or photographic anomaly, but with the same clarity and definition as every other family member. His pale hand rested on Margaret's chair. His dark eyes looked directly out from the image with that same disturbing intensity Pembroke remembered from the session. What made the boy's presence in the photograph even more unsettling was how naturally he seemed to belong to the family group. His clothing matched their formal style perfectly. His posture complemented the overall composition. Even his facial features showed subtle resemblances to the other family members, as if he were truly their son and brother. Pembroke examined the negative with a magnifying glass, searching for any technical explanation for the boy's appearance. Double exposure, chemical contamination, problems with the photographic plate, any rational cause that might explain what he was seeing. He found none. The image showed every sign of being a straightforward, technically perfect portrait of 5 people, despite the fact that only 4 people had been acknowledged as present during the session. Over the following days, Pembroke found himself obsessing over the mysterious portrait. He created multiple prints, each time hoping that the boy's image might prove to be some form of processing error that would disappear with proper technique. Instead, every print showed the same 5 figures arranged in perfect formal composition. More disturbing than the boy's presence in the photographs was Pembroke's growing realization that his own memory of the session was becoming increasingly uncertain. Had there actually been 5 people in the studio that afternoon? Had the Whitmore family really seemed unable to see the boy, or had that been some form of misunderstanding on his part? The harder he tried to recall the exact details of what had occurred, the more his recollections seemed to shift and blur. A week after the session, Pembroke delivered the finished portrait to the Whitmore residence as promised. The family received the photograph with appropriate satisfaction. Commenting on the technical quality and dignified composition, they showed no surprise or concern about the 5th figure in the image, discussing the portrait as if it depicted exactly what they had expected to see. It was only as Pembroke was preparing to leave that Catherine Whitmore, the elder daughter, made a comment that would haunt him for years to come. "He looks so natural in the portrait, doesn't he?" she said, gazing at the photograph with an expression that might have been sadness. "Sometimes I almost forget that he was ever really there at all." When Pembroke asked what she meant, Catherine looked at him with the same polite confusion that had characterized the family's behavior throughout his interactions with them. "I'm sorry, Mr. Pembroke, but I'm not sure what you're referring to. Is there something about the portrait that concerns you?" That evening, Pembroke made the decision that would consume the remainder of his career. He would investigate the Whitmore family's history, searching for any information that might explain the mysterious 5th member of their household portrait. Act 2. The Investigation. When the past refuses to stay buried, what Augustus Pembroke discovered in the weeks following his delivery of the Whitmore family portrait would challenge not only his understanding of photography, but his fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. His investigation began with the methodical approach of a professional documenting his work, but it would evolve into something far more disturbing as the evidence led him into territories where reason and explanation failed. Pembroke's first step was to research the Whitmore family's background through Manchester's public records, birth certificates, property deeds, church registries, all the documentation that would normally provide a clear picture of a prominent family's history. What he found was both comprehensive and deeply puzzling. The official records confirmed everything he had expected about the Whitmore family. Henry Whitmore, born 1845 in Leeds, had established his textile business in Manchester in 1868. Margaret Whitmore, née Ashford, born 1850 in York, had married Henry in 1869. Their daughter Catherine was born in 1870, followed by Elizabeth in 1872. The family had lived at the same prestigious address on Cromwell Street since 1873. But nowhere in any official documentation was there any record of a son. No birth certificate, no baptismal record, no school enrollment, no mention in any family document that Pembroke could locate. According to every available source, the Whitmore family consisted of exactly 4 members, the parents and their 2 daughters. Pembroke expanded his investigation to include less formal sources of information. He interviewed household staff, questioned neighbors, consulted with tradespeople who had dealings with the family. The pattern of responses was consistent and disturbing. No one recalled the Whitmores ever having a son. The family was universally described as consisting of the parents and 2 daughters, exactly as the official records indicated. Yet the photographic evidence remained undeniable. The boy in the portrait was as clearly documented as any other family member, captured with perfect technical precision in an image that showed no signs of manipulation or error. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a prominent Manchester physician who had attended both Whitmore daughters during childhood illnesses, agreed to speak with Pembroke about the family's medical history. Dr. Hartwell's records, maintained with the meticulous care typical of Victorian medical practice, documented every consultation, treatment, and health concern affecting the family over a period of nearly 15 years. The Whitmores have always been a family of 4, Dr. Hartwell confirmed. I delivered both daughters myself, and I can assure you that Mrs. Whitmore has never been pregnant with any other children. There has certainly never been a son in the household. When Pembroke showed Dr. Hartwell the family portrait, the physician's reaction was immediate and unsettling. "This is a remarkable photograph," Dr. Hartwell said, studying the image carefully. "The technical quality is exceptional, and the family appears to be in excellent health. However, I noticed there seems to be some kind of shadow or optical illusion at the edge of the composition, perhaps a problem with the lighting or the photographic plate." Pembroke was stunned. Dr. Hartwell was looking directly at the same image that showed 5 clearly defined figures, yet he perceived only 4 family members and dismissed the boy as a technical anomaly. To verify his own perception, Pembroke showed the portrait to his assistant, James Morrison, a young man who had worked with him for 3 years and was thoroughly familiar with photographic techniques and potential problems. Morrison's response was identical to Dr. Hartwell's. He saw 4 family members and noted what he described as an interesting shadow effect, where Pembroke saw the mysterious boy. When pressed to describe the shadow more specifically, Morrison became vague and uncomfortable, as if trying to focus on something that his mind refused to process clearly. The realization that he might be the only person capable of seeing the boy in the portrait filled Pembroke with a growing sense of isolation and doubt. Was he experiencing some form of mental breakdown? Had the stress of maintaining a successful photography business finally affected his sanity? To test his own psychological state, Pembroke created a series of self-portraits using identical equipment and techniques to those employed for the Whitmore session. The results were technically perfect and showed no anomalies or signs of the perceptual problems that might explain what he had captured in the family portrait. Desperate for objective verification of what he was experiencing, Pembroke decided to approach the investigation from a different angle. Rather than trying to prove the boy's existence, he would attempt to discover why others seemed unable to perceive him. His research led him to Dr. Margaret Sinclair, one of the few female physicians practicing in Manchester, and a specialist in what were then called nervous disorders. Dr. Sinclair had studied at the University of Edinburgh and had particular expertise in cases involving unusual perceptual experiences. When Pembroke explained his situation to Dr. Sinclair, She listened with the careful attention of a trained medical professional. Her questions were precise and insightful, designed to evaluate both his psychological state and the validity of his claims. "Mr. Pembroke," she said finally, "you appear to be in excellent mental health. Your descriptions are coherent, your reasoning is sound, and you show no signs of the conditions that typically produce hallucinatory experiences. However, what you're describing challenges our fundamental understanding of human perception and photographic technology." Dr. Sinclair agreed to examine the portrait personally, bringing to the task both medical expertise and scientific objectivity. Her reaction was similar to that of the other professionals Pembroke had consulted. She saw 4 family members and noted some kind of unusual shadow or lighting effect at the edge of the composition, but Dr. Sinclair's medical training led her to a different conclusion than the others had reached. "There is definitely something anomalous in this photograph," she told Pembroke. "While I cannot see what you describe as a fifth figure, I can detect that something is present in the image that my mind seems unable to process clearly. It's as if there's information in the photograph that exists below the threshold of conscious perception." Dr. Sinclair's observation opened up a new possibility that Pembroke had not previously considered. Perhaps the boy was visible in the photograph, but only certain people possessed the perceptual ability to see him clearly. This would explain why Pembroke could perceive the figure while others saw only shadows or anomalies. To test this theory, Dr. Sinclair arranged for Pembroke to show the portrait to a carefully selected group of individuals who had reported unusual perceptual experiences, people who claimed to see things that others could not, or who had demonstrated sensitivity to phenomena beyond normal human awareness. The results of this experiment were both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Of the 12 individuals examined, 3 were able to see the boy in the photograph with the same clarity that Pembroke experienced. The remaining 9 perceived only the 4 family members, though several noted the same shadow effects that other observers had mentioned. Even more intriguing were the reactions of those who could see the boy clearly. All 3 became visibly distressed when viewing the portrait, describing feelings of unease and wrongness that they could not rationally explain. One woman, a seamstress named Mary Ashford, who claimed to have psychic sensitivity, refused to look at the photograph for more than a few seconds. "There's something terribly wrong with that child," she told Dr. Sinclair. "He doesn't belong with that family. He doesn't belong anywhere in our world. Looking at him makes me feel as if something cold and hungry is looking back at me." These reactions convinced Pembroke that his investigation needed to focus not just on the Whitmore family's history, but on the mysterious boy himself. Who was he? Where had he come from? And why did his presence in the photograph provoke such disturbing responses in those sensitive enough to perceive him? Pembroke's research took him into the darker corners of Manchester's history, exploring records of missing children, unexplained deaths, and family tragedies that might have created the conditions for supernatural manifestation. What he discovered painted a picture of the city's past that was far more complex and disturbing than its prosperous industrial facade suggested. The area where the Whitmore family lived had a history of tragedy dating back several decades. In 1858, a cholera epidemic had swept through Manchester, claiming the lives of hundreds of residents, including many children. The disease struck particularly hard in the neighborhoods that would later become fashionable districts for the newly wealthy merchant class. Pembroke found records indicating that the land where the Whitmore house now stood had previously been the site of a temporary morgue during the epidemic. Dozens of bodies, many unidentified, had been processed through makeshift facilities before burial in mass graves outside the city. Even more disturbing were the records of a private tragedy that had occurred in 1863. The Weatherby family, previous owners of the property that would later be purchased by Henry Whitmore, had lost their 12-year-old son Thomas in what was officially recorded as a drowning accident in the nearby Irwell River. The circumstances of Thomas Weatherby's death were unusual enough to have attracted newspaper attention at the time. The boy had disappeared from his family's garden during a summer afternoon, despite the presence of household staff who should have noticed his departure. His body was found 3 days later in the river, but the condition of the remains suggested he had been in the water for much longer than the timeline of his disappearance would indicate. More puzzling still were the reports of witnesses who claimed to have seen Thomas Weatherby in various locations throughout Manchester during the days after his supposed death. These sightings were dismissed by authorities as cases of mistaken identity or grief-induced hallucinations, but the consistency of the descriptions was remarkable. Pembroke obtained a daguerreotype of Thomas Weatherby from the Manchester Historical Society's archives, taken as part of a family portrait shortly before the boy's death. When he compared this image to the mysterious figure in the Whitmore portrait, the resemblance was unmistakable. The same dark eyes, the same distinctive facial structure, even the same formal clothing style that had been fashionable among wealthy families of the 1860s. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If the boy in the Whitmore portrait was indeed Thomas Weatherby, then Pembroke had somehow captured the image of a child who had died more than 20 years earlier. But how was such a thing possible? And why would the spirit of a dead child attach itself to a family that had no connection to his life or death? Pembroke's investigation into Thomas Weatherby's background revealed additional disturbing details. The boy had been described by his teachers and family friends as unusually intelligent but emotionally distant. He showed little interest in typical childhood activities, preferring to spend his time reading adult books or conducting what he called experiments in the family's garden shed. Even more unsettling were reports that Thomas had demonstrated an unusual interest in death and dying. Servants recalled finding him in the family cemetery, studying tombstones and asking detailed questions about the deceased buried there. His tutor noted that the boy seemed to possess knowledge about death and decomposition that was inappropriate for his age and disturbing in its accuracy. The circumstances of Thomas's disappearance also suggested something more complex than a simple drowning accident. Several witnesses reported seeing the boy near the river on the day he vanished, but their descriptions were contradictory and confusing. Some claimed he appeared to be following someone, though no other person was visible. Others reported that he seemed to be talking to invisible companions, carrying on conversations with people who were not there. Most disturbing of all were the accounts of Thomas's behavior in the weeks before his death. Family members reported that he had become increasingly withdrawn and secretive, spending long hours in his room engaged in activities that he refused to discuss. His younger sister claimed that he had told her he was preparing for a journey, but would not explain what he meant. The pattern that emerged from Pembroke's research suggested that Thomas Weatherby had been no ordinary child, and that his death might not have been the simple accident that official records indicated. But how did this connect to his apparent manifestation in the Whitmore family portrait more than 2 decades later? The answer, when Pembroke finally discovered it, was more horrifying than anything he had imagined possible. The breakthrough in Augustus Pembroke's investigation came from an unexpected source: a conversation with Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, Margaret Whitmore's elderly aunt, who had been present during the early days of the Whitmore family's residence on Cromwell Street. Mrs. Ashford, now in her 70s and living in a modest cottage on the outskirts of Manchester, had initially been reluctant to discuss family matters with an outsider, but Pembroke's persistence and his disturbing photographic evidence eventually convinced her to reveal secrets that the Whitmore family had guarded for more than 20 years. "You have to understand," Mrs. Ashford said, her hands trembling as she poured tea in her small cluttered sitting room. "What happened to that family when they first moved to Cromwell Street was not natural. Not natural at all. And poor Margaret. She never recovered from what she did to protect her daughters." Mrs. Ashford's story began in the spring of 1873, when Henry and Margaret Whitmore first took possession of the house that had previously belonged to the Weatherby family. The property had remained vacant for nearly 10 years following Thomas Weatherby's death, partly due to financial complications surrounding the estate, but primarily because of the disturbing events that had continued to occur there long after the family's departure. "The Weatherbys never spoke publicly about what happened in that house after Thomas died," Mrs. Ashford continued. "But Margaret confided in me about the occurrences that began almost immediately after they moved in. Strange sounds during the night, objects moving without explanation, and most disturbing of all, the sense of being watched by someone who was not there. The phenomena initially seemed like typical manifestations that Victorian families often attributed to settling houses or overactive imaginations. But as months passed, the events became more frequent and more specifically focused on the Whitmore children, particularly their daughters Catherine and Elizabeth. Margaret Whitmore began documenting these occurrences in a private diary, entries that Mrs. Ashford had been permitted to read many years later. The diary painted a picture of a household under siege by forces that defied rational explanation. Catherine, then 3 years old, began talking about her brother, an invisible playmate who, according to her detailed descriptions, was an older boy who lived in the house but whom adults could not see. She described him with remarkable consistency: dark hair, pale skin, dark eyes that looked sad, and clothing that seemed to belong to an earlier era. Even more disturbing were Catherine's reports of conversations with this invisible brother. She claimed he told her stories about living in the house before, described in detail rooms and furnishings that had not existed during the Whitmore's residence, but which perfectly matched the Weatherby family's previous decor. Elizabeth, younger and more sensitive than her sister, reacted to the invisible presence with fear and distress. She refused to sleep alone, claiming that the boy stood beside her bed at night, watching her with eyes that never blinked. She began showing signs of severe anxiety, including sleepwalking episodes during which she would be found in parts of the house where she had no reason to go. Margaret Whitmore's diary entries revealed a mother's growing desperation as she watched her daughters being affected by phenomena she could not see or understand. Henry, skeptical and focused on his business concerns, dismissed his wife's fears as feminine hysteria and refused to consider moving to a different residence. The situation reached a crisis in the winter of 1874, when both daughters began showing signs of what Victorian medicine classified as nervous exhaustion. Catherine, now 4 years old, spent hours each day playing elaborate games with her invisible companion, games that seemed to drain her physical energy and leave her pale and listless. Elizabeth developed a persistent fever that no physician could explain or treat effectively. It was during this period that Margaret Whitmore made the decision that would change her family's fate forever. Unable to convince her husband to move from the house and watching her daughter's health deteriorate under the influence of whatever presence haunted their home, she decided to confront the situation directly. Margaret had been raised in Yorkshire by a grandmother who practiced what polite society euphemistically called folk remedies, traditional methods for dealing with spiritual disturbances that the church refused to acknowledge. Using knowledge passed down through generations of women in her family, Margaret attempted to communicate with whatever force was affecting her children. The séance she conducted in February 1875, alone in her daughter's nursery while they slept, succeeded beyond anything she had expected or desired. Through techniques her grandmother had taught her, Margaret established contact with the presence that had been haunting her family. What she discovered horrified her. The spirit communicating through her makeshift séance was indeed Thomas Weatherby, the boy who had died in the house 12 years earlier. But death had not brought him peace or resolution. Instead, he had become trapped in a state between life and death, anchored to the house by circumstances surrounding his demise that were far more complex than the simple drowning accident recorded in official documents. Thomas revealed to Margaret that his death had not been accidental, but the result of his own experimentation with forces beyond human understanding. In the weeks before his disappearance, he had been conducting rituals based on occult knowledge acquired from books in his family's extensive library, rituals designed to allow him to exist simultaneously in the worlds of the living and the dead. The boy's experiments had succeeded, but not in the way he had intended. Instead of granting him power over death, they had trapped him in a liminal existence where he remained conscious and aware, but unable to truly live or properly die. He had been condemned to haunt the house where he had conducted his fatal experiments, feeding on the life force of living children, to maintain his ghostly existence. Margaret realized with horror that her daughters were being gradually drained by Thomas's supernatural hunger. Catherine's imaginary friend and Elizabeth's mysterious illness were both manifestations of the dead boy's desperate attempts to sustain himself by drawing energy from the living children who now occupied his former home. The solution that Margaret devised was as ingenious as it was morally compromising. Rather than attempting to banish Thomas through traditional exorcism, which might simply drive him to find other victims, she offered him a different form of sustenance. If he would cease his harmful influence over her daughters, she would provide him with a permanent place in their family, not as a threatening presence, but as a recognized member of their household. The bargain Margaret struck with Thomas Weatherby's spirit was documented in coded entries in her diary that Mrs. Ashford had decoded only years later. Thomas would be allowed to exist as part of the Whitmore family, appearing in photographs and family gatherings, but only to those with the sensitivity to perceive him. In exchange, he would protect rather than harm Margaret's daughters, serving as a guardian spirit who would shield them from other supernatural threats. The arrangement worked exactly as Margaret had intended. Catherine and Elizabeth's health improved dramatically once Thomas ceased drawing energy from them. The disturbing phenomena in the house continued, but took on a protective rather than threatening quality. Objects would move to prevent accidents, strange sounds would warn of dangers, and both daughters reported that their invisible brother now helped rather than frightened them. But the cost of this supernatural bargain was higher than Margaret had anticipated. Thomas's presence in the family required constant energy to maintain, energy that had to come from somewhere. Margaret herself began serving as the primary source of this spiritual sustenance, gradually sacrificing her own vitality to keep the dead boy satisfied and benevolent. The physical and psychological toll on Margaret was severe. She aged prematurely, developed chronic illnesses that physicians could not diagnose, and began displaying symptoms that resembled what modern medicine would recognize as severe depression. Most disturbing of all, she began losing the ability to distinguish between the living and the dead, sometimes forgetting which of her children existed in the physical world and which existed only in the supernatural realm. Henry Whitmore remained unaware of the true nature of his family's situation. His inability to perceive Thomas's presence, combined with his Victorian male dismissal of his wife's concerns, allowed the supernatural arrangement to continue without his knowledge or interference. He attributed his wife's declining health to the normal stresses of motherhood and his daughter's improved behavior to proper parental discipline. The family portrait that Pembroke had photographed in 1886 represented the culmination of more than a decade of this impossible coexistence between the living and the dead. Thomas had become so integrated into the family's spiritual structure that he appeared naturally in formal photographs, visible to those with the proper sensitivity, but invisible to the majority of observers. Mrs. Ashford's revelations explain not only the boy's presence in the portrait, but also the disturbing reactions of those who could perceive him clearly. Thomas Weatherby was not simply a harmless spirit posing for family photographs. He was a supernatural predator who had learned to disguise his predatory nature as familial affection, maintained through an arrangement that slowly consumed the life force of his adopted mother. The full horror of the situation became clear when Mrs. Ashford revealed the ultimate fate of Margaret Whitmore. In 1889, 3 years after the portrait was taken, Margaret died under mysterious circumstances that physicians attributed to heart failure. But Mrs. Ashford knew the truth. Margaret had finally exhausted her spiritual energy maintaining Thomas's existence, and her death was the inevitable result of years of supernatural parasitism. Even more disturbing was what happened after Margaret's death. With his primary source of sustenance gone, Thomas began seeking new victims to maintain his existence. Catherine and Elizabeth, now adults, found themselves once again under spiritual assault as the dead boy attempted to resume feeding on their life force. The sisters' response to this renewed supernatural threat was as desperate as their mothers had been. Unable to banish Thomas through conventional means, they made the ultimate sacrifice to protect themselves and any future children they might have. Both women entered a convent, choosing lives of celibacy and religious isolation that would deny Thomas access to new generations of victims. Catherine and Elizabeth Whitmore died as elderly nuns in 1923, having spent their entire adult lives in religious seclusion to protect the world from the supernatural predator their mother had inadvertently created. But their sacrifice was not sufficient to end the threat that Thomas represented. Mrs. Ashford's final revelation was the most disturbing of all. Thomas Weatherby's spirit had not died with the Whitmore family. Deprived of his familiar sources of sustenance, he had begun seeking out new families to victimize. Drawn to households with young children who could provide the spiritual energy he required for continued existence, the pattern was always the same. Thomas would attach himself to families living in houses with histories of tragedy or death, manifesting first as an invisible playmate for the children, then gradually draining their vitality as he had attempted to do with the Whitmore daughters. But unlike Margaret Whitmore, who had found a way to appease him temporarily, most families had no knowledge of what they were confronting or how to protect themselves. Mrs. Ashford had spent years tracking reports of unexplained childhood illnesses, mysterious family tragedies, and supernatural manifestations throughout Manchester and the surrounding areas. The pattern was consistent and horrifying. Every few years, a new family would report the same phenomena: children talking to invisible friends, mysterious illnesses that physicians could not diagnose, photographs that seemed to show additional figures that no one could remember being present. "He's still out there," Mrs. Ashford told Pembroke, her voice barely above a whisper, "still hunting for families to feed upon, and each time he grows stronger, more cunning in his methods of concealment." The portrait you took may be the clearest evidence of his existence that anyone has ever captured. The implications of Mrs. Ashford's revelation struck Pembroke with devastating force. By creating a clear photographic record of Thomas Weatherby's supernatural existence, he had inadvertently provided proof that could help other families recognize and defend against the threat. But he had also created a dangerous artifact that might serve to strengthen Thomas's presence in the physical world. Pembroke's investigation had begun as a professional curiosity about an unusual photographic anomaly. It had evolved into the discovery of one of the most dangerous supernatural entities in Victorian England, a predatory spirit that had learned to disguise itself as a harmless family member while systematically destroying the lives of innocent children. The photographer faced an impossible choice. He could attempt to warn other families about the threat Thomas represented, but doing so would require him to make public claims about supernatural phenomena that would destroy his professional reputation and likely result in his commitment to an asylum. Alternatively, he could remain silent, allowing Thomas to continue his predatory activities while protecting his own social and professional standing. But there was a third option, one that Mrs. Ashford suggested with the grim pragmatism of someone who had witnessed decades of Thomas's destructive influence. The portrait you created contains his image captured at a moment when his supernatural nature was fully manifested, she explained. If that photograph were to be destroyed completely, burned until no trace remained, it might weaken his connection to the physical world enough to banish him permanently. The prospect of destroying his most technically perfect and historically significant photograph was agonizing for a professional artist like Pembroke, but the alternative, allowing his work to serve as an anchor for a supernatural predator, was even more unacceptable. On a cold November evening in 1886, exactly 1 month after he had photographed the Whitmore family, Augustus Pembroke built a fire in the courtyard behind his studio and fed the flames with every print and negative he had created of the mysterious portrait. As the photographs cooled and blackened in the heat, he thought he heard something that might have been a child's scream carried on the winter wind. But Pembroke's sacrifice proved insufficient to end the threat. Thomas Weatherby's spirit had existed independently of any single photographic record for more than 2 decades. The destruction of the portraits weakened his manifestation temporarily, but did not banish him permanently from the physical world. In the years following the burning of the photographs, Pembroke continued to receive reports of supernatural activity that matched Thomas's characteristic patterns. Families throughout northern England reported the same disturbing phenomena: invisible playmates who drained children's vitality, mysterious illnesses that defied medical treatment, and photographs that seemed to show additional figures that no one remembered being present. The photographer spent the remainder of his career documenting these cases, creating a secret archive of evidence about Thomas Weatherby's continuing predatory activities. His files, discovered only after his death in 1923, contained testimonies from dozens of families who had been victimized by the supernatural entity. Along with Pembroke's increasingly desperate attempts to find a permanent solution to the threat. But Thomas had learned from his encounters with the Whitmore family and Augustus Pembroke. He became more cautious in his manifestations, more subtle in his methods of feeding, and more skilled at avoiding detection by those who might recognize his supernatural nature. The clear, undeniable evidence that Pembroke had captured in the 1886 portrait was never again documented so explicitly. Today, more than 130 years after that fateful photographic session, the case of Thomas Weatherby remains one of the most disturbing and well-documented supernatural phenomena in British history. The child who should not have existed in the Whitmore family portrait represents a form of supernatural predator that may still be active, continuing his centuries-long hunt for families to victimize. Modern paranormal investigators who have studied Pembroke's secret archives have identified patterns suggesting that Thomas's influence extends far beyond the Manchester area where he first manifested. Reports of similar phenomena: children with invisible playmates who seem to drain their vitality, mysterious childhood illnesses that resist medical treatment, family photographs that show unexplained additional figures, continue to surface throughout the English-speaking world. The boy in the 1886 portrait serves as a warning that some forms of evil are not content to remain buried with the dead. Thomas Weatherby's experiments with forces beyond human understanding created a supernatural entity that learned to feed on the innocence and vitality of children, disguising its predatory nature as familial affection. The portrait that Augustus Pembroke destroyed in 1886 may be gone, but the threat it documented continues to exist. Somewhere in the shadows between the living and the dead, Thomas Weatherby still hunts for new families to exploit, new children to drain, new victims to sustain his impossible existence. Parents who notice their children developing invisible playmates, physicians who encounter unexplained childhood illnesses, photographers who capture mysterious additional figures in family portraits. All may be witnessing the continuing predatory activities of a supernatural entity that refuses to accept the finality of death. The boy who shouldn't have existed serves as a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved, some photographs better left unexamined, and some truths too dangerous to be fully understood. In a world where the boundaries between life and death remain more permeable than we dare to acknowledge, the hunt for innocent victims continues, guided by the hunger of a child who learned to make death itself serve his insatiable needs. The portrait is gone, but the horror it documented lives on, waiting for the next family to welcome an invisible friend into their home, unaware that some friendships exact a price that no child should ever be asked to pay.